Good morning, everyone. It's very unfortunate that I wasn't able to be with you in person this morning, but regardless of unexpected conflicts, we figured out a way for me to still share my message with you this morning. So hopefully this format works, and I really hope it will. Well, today's scripture is from the book of Matthew, and it is a very important story of Jesus as it marks the very beginning of his earthly ministry. So we've gone through the Christmas story of Christ as a child, and now he is really beginning his intentional ministry as the Jesus that we know. So just previously, before the story, John the Baptist was in the wilderness, eating bugs, wearing camel skin, leather belt, all of that, but he was preparing the way for Christ's coming, for this event. And then immediately after this, Jesus then retreats into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted by the devil. So it's just one thing after another. It's moving very quickly from this point. Jesus' earthly mission begins in a potentially odd place for someone who is without sin, as we understand it. In the waters of baptism. That is a strange place for someone who is without sin. Really, why would Jesus need to be baptized? Even John the Baptist wondered this, as he said to Christ himself, I need to be baptized by you, and you come to me? To which Jesus responds, let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Fulfill all righteousness? I'm sure even John was a bit perplexed by that. But like in all else that Christ did, this action served as a symbol, a beacon towards a new way of life, a life of grace and discipleship. And I will explain that a little bit further. So this act of Jesus being baptized in a very human way, in the wilderness, by someone faithful to God who is also very human, in the presence of many others, was in a very public display of Christ revealing his identity to the world. So taking an overt position of humility and solidarity with humanity. So through this symbol, he is also being shown that even though Christ is fully divine, he is also fully human, and intimately so with us. He participates in humanity completely, fully, as one with us, and that's very important. So this also says that this is saying something about God as well, God's identity, God's nature among us. God came to us in humility as a child. Then, in this story, he was baptized into the community, becoming one of us by a man. So this is the concept that we talked about at Christmas time. Emmanuel, God with us, God fully with us as a participating member of us, actively involved in human life in order to save it. So this was incredibly important, as prior to this, in the culture of the day, God was not really accessible to man, except through practitioners at the temples and priests. So they had a say on what righteousness was. They kind of had a monopoly over everything, and it wasn't letting God freely move through anyone. So, however, with this act of being made man, being born as a human, and then coming in humility to then be baptized by this human community, God made God's self completely available, literally within hand's reach of the people there, and sort of within hand's reach of us now as we live in the same spirit of this story. Then God moved into the neighborhood, literally and figuratively. Like it says in the scripture of John, the Word became flesh and moved into the neighborhood. This is that very act of joining the community, building a covenant with everyone, and being humbled by it. At least in a way that we aren't able to previously recognize. Whereas before, God was always with us. Now we fully know it because we're actually speaking to a physical representation of God. So now when we experience baptism, we are sharing that act, that sacrament with Christ now, in this example. When we feel the call to baptism, we're participating in a covenant between ourselves, our community, and the whole of creation. We follow in Jesus' footsteps, beginning a new life, a life set apart, a life with Christ in each other, and a life of discipleship. Now, I would like to try something a little bit different. A lot of you may not know, but I'm involved in a pilot program with the Community of Christ called the Spiritual Formation and Companionship Pilot Program. It's a very long name. We're looking for a new one. But the purpose of this program is to develop deeper prayer lives within ourselves. It's a covenant group of about 50 people. We meet twice a year. And in each session that we meet out, we practiced new forms of spiritual practices, both to deepen our personal prayer lives, but also to prepare to be spiritual companions for other people to help through whatever life may bring. Spiritual crises, times of spiritual joy, uncertainty, just questions. But through this experience, I've gained a lot of value and perspective on reading Scripture in new ways and experiencing the Word as something that can read me internally, read the unconscious motions in my mind that help me learn a lot about myself and what God is doing in my life and in the lives of people around me. So, I'd like to try one practice, not right now, but first I'd like to have a little bit of group discussion, allow a little bit of time for discussion, and then we'll get into the practice, and I'll fully explain that in a second. But first, let's talk about our own experiences of baptism. In any congregation I've ever been to, this is one of the most exciting times. It may not seem like it, but when people talk about their experience of baptism, there's just this joy that fills the room of people being able to perfectly recount their experience with that, whether it be the temperature of the water, their family, or just what the weight of that commitment, that experience meant to them. So we're going to take a little time to speak about our baptisms today. So in either groups of 2, 3, 4, who's ever around you that you can easily speak to without having to turn completely around or walk, just take about 2 minutes to describe in detail your baptism experience. So not just what happened during the day, but maybe look a little internally. What were some of the emotions felt during the baptism itself, leading up to? What were you feeling in that time? And then along that, what were some expectations of what you might feel, why you were engaged in the baptism in the first place? So I'll give you 2 minutes to discuss that, and we'll move on to the next question. And the next question is about the church context in which your baptism happened. Who was there? Who were you baptized in Chariton or somewhere else? Who was there at the time? Was it your family, members of the congregation? And how did that shape your experience of baptism? And again, we'll discuss this for 2 minutes, and then we'll move on to the spiritual practice. But this is very important for the practice. Okay, so let's try something that might be new for many of you. This is a spiritual practice called imaginative contemplation. And this is from the tradition of St. Ignatius of Loyola. He developed many spiritual practices in his time, had many monasteries, but he also developed different retreats for people who were lay ministers, people who did not have the time to be full-time monks. But a way to develop a prayer life in the everyday for people. So imaginative contemplation is a practice in which we take a very deep look into Scripture and experience it in a very sensory way. I've appreciated this because it has allowed me the opportunity to almost experience Scripture as parts of myself. I can have memories of scriptural stories as if I had actually experienced them because of the very deep and sensory nature of this. So as we just talked about our baptisms, and while your mind is still on that, let's take all those feelings, expectations, and moments and bring them into an experience of Christ's own baptism. So I will be reading through the scripture twice, and the first time I read it, I'd like you to allow your mind to imagine every detail of the story. So from whose perspective are you imagining this? Are you John the Baptist himself? Are you a member of the crowd that's surrounding? Are you a child, adult, man, woman? Are you a bird on a tree? It could be from any perspective, just as long as you can feel that authentically and allow your thoughts to flow. And then other details about the story. What is the river like? Is it cold? Is it flowing? Is it calm? Is it moving at all? Um, what are the trees like? The temperature of the day? Is it morning? Is it evening? What do John and Jesus' voice sound like? Are they deep and booming? Are they light and quiet? It's really up to you. Yeah, and now I'll read the scripture the first time, and then I'll give you instructions for the second time. Okay, let's begin the practice by just taking a few deep breaths together and enter it into the scripture as if you were praying in an intercessory way or praying in any way. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to be fulfilled all righteousness." Then he consented, and when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the Beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Now in the second reading, I'd like you to still dwell in the practice of imagining deeply. But throughout the reading, I'd like you to ask yourself these questions. How do you feel? What emotions may be being brought up out of you? This may feel a little odd or uncomfortable at first, but you may notice that maybe a memory comes up from a particular detail or something like that, or you are drawn to a particular detail of the story or something someone said. It may not seem important at the time, but please take note of whatever comes up, and as you go on with your week, you can bring that up later in prayer, and maybe something about your life, your baptism, maybe trying to bubble up out of you. And then ask yourself also this question: to what am I being invited? So, to what does this story bring out of me? How do I feel invited to respond as a disciple, someone who follows Christ and has made that commitment through baptism? And how are we being invited to respond to the story as a congregation? How has our story of baptism shaped us, and how is it calling us to go out, to invite, to be a hospitable community of that covenant that we made? And 2 minutes to discuss that. Then Jesus came from Galilee to John at the Jordan to be baptized by him. John would have prevented him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" But Jesus answered him, "Let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness." Then he consented, and when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, the Beloved, with whom I am well pleased."